Boa tarde a todos, obrigada pela presença. Nós estamos muito felizes de receber aqui conosco o professor Ethan Cochrane, da Universidade de Auckland, na Nova Zelândia. I'm going to also speak in English in case we have some English-speaking person in the online audience in our YouTube. So thank you for coming. We're very happy to have Professor Ethan Cochrane from Auckland University in New Zealand to join us for an afternoon in which he will present what he learned in 25 years of research projects in the Pacific. Ethan is here because we have this wonderful project together about ecology and cultural evolution of ancient populations in Southern Hemisphere. That means that we are trying to put together what we know in terms of Brazilian archaeology and Pacific archaeology to try to better understand models of peoplement and also models of human dispersal and so on. This project has been funded by FAPESP and also by the Education New Zealand, so it's a joint project. And without much further ado, I will go back to Portuguese to explain about the background of the project, and then very soon Ethan will tell us about it. Então, pessoal, obrigada por terem vindo. Estou voltando aqui para o português, porque não sei quem está online no momento. Mas só para dizer que o Ethan e eu, nós temos esse projeto em colaboração, que é um projeto que tenta comparar e compartilhar nossas experiências na arqueologia do Hemisfério Sul, então envolvendo arqueologia brasileira e arqueologia do Pacífico. E é um projeto financiado pela FAPESP e pelo Education New Zealand, o qual nós estamos todos muito gratos. So, without much further ado, Ethan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone who's here, and welcome people online. Thankfully, I know many of you in the audience. I've seen you at least from last year, so hopefully we'll have a good time like we did last year. And the title of this talk there, what I've learned from 25 years or so working in the Pacific, is really not going to be here's the answers in the Pacific. It's going to be what I've learned about how you do research and some about what I've learned about the substantive aspects of archaeology in the Pacific, so answers in the Pacific. So maybe it's good that some of you are students or maybe young scholars who sounds too full of myself to say maybe you can learn from some of my mistakes, but maybe you can learn from some of my mistakes, or just what I've learned. But yeah, so this is a mix of theory and archaeological conclusions. And what I do is I'm running through about 10 papers I wrote, maybe it's 8, over the last 25 years. And I kind of just talk about each paper really briefly and some of the, again, substantive conclusions from it, and also some of what I learned about doing research in that particular paper. With full disclosure, I gave a similar talk in my own department about a month ago. In our department seminar series, we organized it so all of the academic staff talked to each other about our current research, kind of a let's get to know each other again after 3 years of COVID, whatever. And so this is based on that talk. I've took that same kind of idea, but developed it a bit for a slightly different audience. So that's what we're gonna do. And hopefully, I guess, I'll leave you with some unanswered questions and things to ponder and think about, because that's largely what I have, a bunch of unanswered questions. Okay, let's got my various screens here. All right. The first thing here, this is a paper from 2001. It's not quite 25 years ago, 23 years ago, but 25 sounds better in a title. So, and plus I've actually started, my first archaeological research or experience in the Pacific was probably in 1995. So it's about that long ago. But for this paper, I looked at a couple things, and let me give you some background before we kind of, I talk about the aspects of that paper. First off, in East Polynesia, which is this area here, out in the vast Pacific, in East Polynesia, there is what we might call a temple complex. Now, you all are probably familiar with this image up at top, at least you recognize what that is. That's a large stone statue called a moai from Easter Island. And they are unique, and you probably, again, recognize them. Everyone does around the world for their uniqueness. But they really are just one manifestation of an East Polynesian-wide temple complex where people built megalithic stone architecture. It just happens to be in Easter Island that they made these large, I mean, you would call this a tiki in that part of the world. But in the Marquesas, which is nearby, there's Easter, oh, my little thing's not working anymore. In the Easter Island here, over here in Tahiti and the Marquesas, they have similar stone structures as well as similar stone tiki, but they're not simply as massive and giant and abundant as they are in Rapa Nui. So again, this complex all over the Pacific. There we have what's called a moai, that Easter Island stone statue on the top. The middle picture is a similar kind of monumental stone temple from Hawaii called a heiau. And the one on the bottom is from the Society Islands called a marae. But they're all highly related culturally. They were all constructed by related populations, all beginning about 1,000 years ago. So again, moai are just part of the larger complex of these East Polynesian stone temples. Now, what I want to point out first is that first bullet point there is that many archaeologists, I think maybe you're familiar with this where you work in your part of the world, is that archaeologists will label aspects of the archaeological record with a noun, depending on their natural language. You know, I'm calling these temples, right? And right there, you probably have developed some expectations about their explanation. Oh, they're temples, so then they must have been built for religious purposes and perhaps by elite people in religions, and perhaps they were used in a variety of ways to coerce the population or establish ownership of areas. But all the things that we think about when we think about the word temple, you probably automatically apply those things to this archaeological record when I use the word temple to describe it. So that's what I mean by that first bullet point, that most archaeologists label the world using nouns from our natural languages, and then we think, okay, the job's done. We've explained the world because we've named it. But what I wanted to point out in this research that I've done is that I don't think that's a really adequate way to explain the archaeological record. I'm not very satisfied with that kind of explanation. And this is what I was thinking about in 2001 when I wrote this paper. And that second bullet point there, what I mean to say is that identifying chunks of the world out there and calling them something, a temple, a habitation structure, a activity area, right? That we name things that way. Those are all arbitrary divisions of the world that are, I'll say it, made up. They're made up by us. There is no natural set of divisions out there in the world that comes at us objectively and without our own creation. So we construct these things. We, as I've written there, we create these units of observation, and we create the things. They don't exist outside of us or apart from us. They come from inside our own heads. So that's kind of a point that I'm thinking about in this paper when I'm looking at East Polynesian architecture. And I have an example there. Let me see, what's my next point? Yes, I have an example there in the middle graph, and that is simply a demonstration of what I've just kind of suggested about we make our own units of observation. We are the ones who create these things out there. They don't exist apart from us. And what I've done is that's a graph from that paper, and it shows on the left-hand side, it shows if you observe these things in the landscape as all simply the same kind of thing. They're all, we'll call them temples again. And I count up the number of temples over time. I get a graph like that, meaning they kind of increase over time, and then the construction of these things levels off. because we've dated a bunch of these constructions, and that's fine. It's a fine description of the world, but you can then drill down into those things we call temples and describe them in a different way, describe them in terms of different kinds of temples based on some criteria we use to call this. For example, in the Society Islands, they have things called national marae, which are big marae, big temples that were associated with particular ethnographically described religious cults. They have small temples, which are associated with, say, fishermen, and other temples that are associated with agriculture. So we can drill down and describe them a different way, and then we get a different distribution over time. So that other image there on the right, that's the distribution over time of a particular kind of subtype within those temple types. And they increase in time, but then decrease in time, all within the same kind of overall patterning of those other pieces of architecture. So my point is, again, is that we create units of observation. They don't exist apart from us. And that ideally, see, I got all my things here. Ideally, when we should recognize that we're constructing these units of observation, and the units of observation we construct, we should link them to particular ideas we have about the world. And by that I mean theory. Whether we're looking at Habitus and Bourdieu, or we're looking at Darwin and evolutionary theory, or we're looking at Anthony Giddens and structuralism. These are kind of social science or humanities and biological theories. Those ideas about what's important in the world, the way we observe the world should be linked to those ideas. And that's typically what we do in the sciences. And I realize that can maybe be kind of contentious, and not everyone would agree with that statement. But that's what I try to do in this paper 23 years ago now. I was really kind of, I did this because I saw in the Pacific how people would explain the archaeological record just by naming it, and they think their job was done. And I didn't think that was kind of deeply unsatisfying to me. So that's my first lesson of what I know about in the Pacific. Move on to another paper. I've written more than these 8 papers, but I decided to show some highlights. Just so you know, so I did things between 2001 and 2006. I just not presented them here, I guess I should say. So now we'll move on to Fiji and talk about some things in Fiji. Again, as I began this talk with, I'm going to leave you with a bunch of unanswered questions, and this is a very, whatever, shotgun approach to the Pacific. So a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there. So you're not going to get a big overall complete picture. But we'll move to Fiji. And what I did in Fiji as, well, first I'll explain kind of the basic culture history of Fiji. That's an image there of some islands in western Fiji. It's actually a much bigger archipelago than that. And Fiji was first settled about 3,000 years ago by populations that are related to the island groups around them, and I'll go into that a bit later. And there was, in the ensuing 3,000 years, there was ceramic change and other artifact change, subsistence change from more of a largely kind of dependent upon hunting and gathering, marine fisheries, to one more dependent on agriculture. There's changes in interaction across the archipelago over time, lots of things that we see throughout the world. And beginning about 1,000 years ago, most archaeologists and anthropologists argue that at that point there were some pretty significant social transformations in Fiji. And that's just what I really mean to say is chiefdoms developed. So this different kind of political and social organization. We see that all over the world, here included. And archaeologists and anthropologists really love to investigate the so-called rise of chiefdoms, right? What causes these changes in social formations? Same in Fiji as well. In Fiji, the data, I would say, the observations that underlie this discussion of the change in social formations from previous institutions to ones of chieftainship, the data that underlies that change is very minimal. There's hardly any archaeological data. It's mostly derived from ethnographies, so the kind of texts written by the British and the Russians and the Americans who were first there in the 18th century and 19th centuries. So I wanted to investigate this a bit more. What really, oh, good Lord. What really causes, or how can we explain these changes in Fiji over time? So what I did is I looked at spatial scale of transmission. That's kind of a fancy way, right, to talk about who's talking, to investigate who's talking to who, right? Transmission is kind of a concept from biology and more generally from evolution, cultural evolution and evolutionary studies, cultural transmission studies. And my idea was that if social formations are changing in Fiji, one measure of that would be changes in the scale at which that people are talking to one another. And I use the term talking loosely because I mean now we talk to people who are on the other side of the planet all the time, right? And so of course, social formations are changing over the last 50, 100 years because of those differences in how we interact and transmit information. Same in the past, people, the scale across which they interacted and transmitted information also was changing. It's changing over time and space. And I thought that might be a proxy or kind of a clue as to what archaeologists are interested in when they talk about chiefdoms. So what I did is I looked at ceramics in these western islands of Fiji and using some geochemical provenance analyses, I determined that the amount of non-local ceramics in these sites decreased over time, meaning if over time fewer and fewer non-local ceramics are in these places, it suggests that people's networks and connections to far away places, that those connections are decreasing because fewer of those materials are coming into these sites. Now, granted, that's only in relation to archaeological ceramics, right? So what you really can say is that people's kind of interaction or transmission networks, who they're talking to, again in quotes, based on ceramics is changing over time, that the scale of that is getting smaller and smaller, more localized. What does that say about any other kind of data we may have on who talks to who? I don't know, but we don't have that data. We're dealing with the archaeological record, you're dealing with the archaeological record. And so that's what this graph in the middle demonstrates. It kind of, if you squint, you can see that the darker gray bars increase in proportion over time, that is from the bottom to the top. That's just the frequency of local ceramics in these sites. So more and more sites, the sites have more and more local ceramics in them, less and less non-local ceramics. That's just the data that comes from these sites in the West. Now, how does this relate to the changes in the proposed changes in social formations in Fiji over time? I don't really know. This is all I've been able to determine with this research, I don't know, it's 18 years ago now, is that we know that the scale of cultural transmission via ceramics got smaller. This happened about 800 years ago, which is around the same time that anthropologists and archaeologists argue that chiefdoms began to rise in Fiji. So perhaps it's related to these, it's certainly related to some kind of new social formation. Again, only kind of legitimately linked to ceramics. Maybe other aspects of human life are also changed at that time, but we know that the transmission of ceramic kind of ideas is changing at that time. How is it related to these other things like new social formations? I don't know, honestly. One of my PhD students is examining this. She's doing the same kind of research as this, but she's doing it across the entire archipelago, which is 300 islands and a lot of space. And she's also using some other techniques to investigate how the scale of transmission may have changed over time. Did small kind of isolated populations arise in this archipelago, or is this the west of Fiji? Is it unique, and the rest of Fiji became one giant kind of population, which you might suggest was a chiefdom? I don't know. But what I want to kind of point out here with this research is that I was thinking about the kinds of questions that my colleagues are interested in, chiefdoms, in particular in the Pacific, but I was unsatisfied. I guess a lot of my stuff is because I'm unsatisfied. I was unsatisfied by the way my colleagues had addressed this, either through ethnography or linguistics. I wanted something a bit more, say, empirical, associated with the archaeological record. That's why we did this work. All right. I'll move on to 2010. Again, I did things between 2006 and 2010. But this was another paper we did with my colleague Carl Lippo. And we, again, took a problem that had been debated and discussed by Pacific Island archaeologists and approached it slightly differently. So the problem is this. On that map there, you see the Western Pacific. And so I'll point out some of those archipelagos. You should perhaps recognize names like New Caledonia and Fiji and Vanuatu. And on the far left there, we have the tip of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, those kinds of places. And to the left of that dashed line, populations have been in that part of the world for 50,000 years. To the right of that dashed line, populations have been there for only 3,000 years. So that dashed line, it's a biogeographic boundary, again, it held people to the west, so to speak. And about 3,000 years ago, populations to the west of that dashed line began to make a really distinctive kind of pottery for the first time ever. And it's that pottery down there. There's examples there on that bottom image, and it's called Lapita pottery. The name just derives from a particular name of a site, archaeological site. People began to make that pottery 3,000 years ago, and at the exact same time, they burst through that boundary, that dashed line, and settled for the first time, the first humans ever, settled all those archipelagos, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Fiji, as well as Tonga and Samoa, which are out there as well. And they also, in that new part of the world, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, etc., they continued making those really intricately decorated, beautiful ceramics, Lapita stuff. As you can see on those images, they have different kinds of very complex designs, which are often created by taking little stamps and making repeated patterns on the designs. So you can, on the pottery, so you can identify repeated motifs on pots. And people have examined those motifs, their presence across different assemblages on these different islands to discuss the relationships between those island populations. So, for example, there might be a lot of a certain kind of Lapita motif in Vanuatu, and you also find that same Lapita motif in Fiji, and that means that people in Fiji and Vanuatu 3,000 years ago were, again, kind of quote-unquote talking to one another, that they were exchanging ideas about how you decorate these pots. And because I know you're not from this part of the world, so you don't know this, but they were not exchanging pots, they were exchanging ideas. The pots are all locally made. I mean, out of the tens of thousands of Lapita sherds that have been excavated, mere handfuls are exotic and do not come from the site they're found in. So people are moving around in canoes back and forth across this area repeatedly and intensely and exchanging ideas about how you decorate your pots. And again, so most archaeologists will look at the similarities in the designs across these archipelagos and try to think about how those populations are related to one another, what areas were settled first based on kind of a design appearing somewhere first and then appearing at another place later. And, how various kind of patterns of interaction, are there different, what you might say, are there different zones of interaction? Like I've circled there, those small dotted lines around the New Caledonia area, around the Vanuatu area, around the Fiji, Tonga, Samoa area. Those are the traditional kind of areas of interaction that archaeologists have identified in these earliest populations in this part of the world. Now, the way they've done this, archaeologists in the past have done this, is they've used techniques that assess overall similarity. And those are called phonetic techniques. So you take a bunch of descriptions of potsherds and you throw them into an algorithm that creates a hierarchical cluster analysis, and out pop these, groups of similarity. I'm sure you've kind of seen that kind of process or done it as well, or know what I'm talking about. But if you want to look at relatedness that's based on cultural transmission, the sharing of information between individuals or any kind of entity, there's a better way to do that, and it's called cladistics. Glauc and I were doing that in New Zealand last year. So cladistics is just a better technique. It makes some assumptions about how similarity changes through sharing. And so my colleague Carl Lippo and I, we used this new kind of technique, not new, but we newly applied this technique to this area to ask the same kind of question. Again, I thought the answers we would derive would be better. Well, they'd be, by better I mean, they'd be more valid. If the question that archaeologists are trying to address in this part of the world is how are these populations related to one another in terms of the, the movement of ideas about how you decorate your pots. Techniques that assess similarity based on the movement of ideas are better than techniques that assess similarity just as an overall giant package, like morphology or shape. So we applied those techniques here. And we got slightly different answers. And this is, so there's one of our answers in the middle there. And those are simply kind of cladistic graphs. And the closer two sites are to one another on those graphs, the more highly related they are in terms of the transmission of these decorations. And there's some slightly different answers than this typical grouping of Fiji and Samoa and Tonga are all alike. New Caledonia is off by itself. These islands of Vanuatu are all alike. If you look at some of these graphs, you'll notice that there's, again, some differences. This is a Fijian site and a Solomon site. So Fiji and the Solomons, they're very similar, which suggests that people are moving back and forth between Fiji and the Solomons and exchanging ideas about how you decorate your pot. All three of these sites are from Fiji, and they're all similar to Tonga, as we would expect. But New Caledonia is also out here. New Caledonia shares relationships with all of those sites. So from here to here, New Caledonia also shares relationships with Fiji and the Solomons. So from here to here and here to here. So with these new techniques, we're able to kind of show that actually the patterns of sharing of ideas about how you decorate your pots, it's more complicated than that. There's a group here, there's a group here, there's a group here. I mean, if you'll note, those are largely just groups defined by space. These guys are all closer to one another in terms of space than any of them are to these guys over here. So archaeologists have kind of drawn lines around them because they think that those spatial differences are more meaningful than other kinds of differences. But in our analysis, we were able to show that no, it's more complicated than that. And actually, we also, in this paper, instead of just producing those phonetic or similarity cluster diagrams, with cladistics, we can put numbers. My pointer's not always working. Cladistics, we can put numbers on these diagrams, and those numbers are statistical assessments of confidence. So it's a very quantitative method, and we can say that, for example, the site here in Fiji and these sites in the Southeast Solomons, they're almost certainly highly related due to the transmission of ideas about decorating your pots. It's kind of complicated, but this number is 72. That means after running this analysis with kind of replicated data, almost like in a simulation, 10,000 times, over 7,000 times, 72% of the time, we get that answer. So it's very unlikely that that answer is not correct. Now, what this also does is it, as I've here at the bottom, this is an empirical question. We're looking at ceramic similarity. How do we explain similarity in these things? When you quantify those answers and you tie to those answers some estimate of your confidence in the answer, your reader can say, well, I don't agree that 72% is, I'm not confident of that kind of answer, so I'm not going to accept what you say. That's fine. Because we can use those numbers to quantify our willingness to accept an answer as correct or not. Instead of just saying, Ethan's a great guy, so I'm gonna agree with him, or I hate Ethan, so I'm gonna disagree with him, right? It gets us away from that kind of ad hoc acceptance of our answers being right or wrong. But we can say how comfortable we are with being wrong. I'm comfortable with being wrong 28% of the time in this analysis for that particular pairing. That's what I'm able to say. And again, with other methods, you're not able to do this. And so this is, again, something we did 15 years ago or so now by looking at an age-old problem and trying to come at it at a different angle and trying to do some things that we thought were valuable. And again, these kind of quantitative analyses. And analyses methods that were really key to the problem we were addressing, or that all anthropologists and archaeologists were addressing. Okay, now we'll jump up to 2016. Another obviously a paper of mine with my colleagues and an interesting problem and some things to learn about. So we'll go back to Samoa. And Samoa, you see on the map there on the top, you can see these two main islands of Samoa called Savaii and Upolu, and you can see where they are positioned kind of in the Western Pacific there. So similar to the map I just showed you. There's some other islands in Samoa to the east, smaller islands, which are not on that particular map. So I mentioned that those islands like Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, they were all first settled 3,000 years ago by people making that really distinctive pottery, which we just talked about. And that pottery appears all across those archipelagos. So I'm not going to go into, I think I've talked at USP before about settlement of the Pacific and colonization, and so I'm not going to get into a big long talk about that. But these islands were all purposely settled by people who had invented celestial navigation and could essentially go wherever and whenever they wanted to after 3,000 years ago. They were going everywhere in this part of the world. So these weren't settled by a pregnant woman drifting on a log who washes up on the beach, right? It's not the way it worked. Or a fishing expedition blown off course. No, these people knew what they were doing. Because these Lapita sites are dense all across those archipelagos. Huge, rich archaeological record, all appearing around the same time, except in Samoa. In Samoa, there's a single archaeological site with Lapita pottery. And the next, dated to 3,000 years ago, and the next oldest archaeological site in Samoa is just a bit later, like at 2750 or 2700 years ago, and it has no Lapita pottery. And then sites come in dribs and drabs kind of after that. However, so one question that archaeologists have struggled with for a long time is, why is there such a limited archaeological record of Lapita settlement in Samoa compared to all the places around it, which were, again, all settled at the same time, all by related people, culturally, probably culturally, biologically, linguistically, to some degree. And one of the reasons for that, for there being a single Lapita archaeological site in Samoa, is because Samoa is undergoing subsidence. That large island, Savaii, it's a massive shield volcano. It was eruptive in the 1800s. It's huge, and it pushes down on the lithosphere, like making a big dish. And Upolu, the island next to it there, that single Lapita site, is actually right there. That side of Upolu is being drugged down in the dish, the deformation created by Savaii being drugged down. So that single Lapita site that was found in Samoa was actually found underwater. It was found because in the 1960s, people were excavating with big diggers a marina for a ferry between the islands. And they did this and put all the spoil on the ground. And one of the geologists or engineers working on it, a guy from New Zealand, recognized this pottery and turtle bone and stone adzes coming out of the buckets. So they eventually recovered that stuff, and there were Lapita pottery there. So most archaeologists have argued that the lack of Lapita pottery sites in Samoa is because they've all been destroyed because this island's kind of sinking, right? Which is true. The island is sinking, and certainly one Lapita site was destroyed because of that, and we dug it up, with that trenching machine. However, in the last decade, lots of work in Samoa, by me and my colleagues primarily, we keep running into the idea that perhaps Samoa really was just very sparsely settled. There was hardly anybody there compared to those nearby archipelagos. I was going to say, for whatever reason, and I have some ideas of why that might be the case, but we didn't really know why it might be the case, but it's seemed like a potential or logical explanation to pursue. Instead of just accepting that all these sites were destroyed through subsidence, why don't we actually think about the idea that there was a small population settled by a small group of people, and that's a contributing factor for the lack of these Lapita sites. And so, so kind of coming at this age-old archaeological problem in Samoa with a bit of a different ideas, and in doing so, we initiated this large coring project across the islands, across the shorelines. And I have just one example here, and this is on it's this island. This is Upolu. This is the Lapita site right here on this image. So we went to the opposite side of the island because that side has subsided less. So it hasn't sunk as much. So it'd be less likely that if there's Lapita sites, and they might not be destroyed there. But we went there, we went here, went back to Mulifanua. We went around the island doing these cores, and never were we able to find any Lapita sites. We also were able to kind of find, we were able to reconstruct the development of some of these shorelines, and some of these shorelines didn't even develop until a couple thousand years ago. Prior to that, they were just rocky shores with no beach. So not a very nice place to build a village, I guess I would say. And that's combined with research of my colleagues who work in other islands just to the west. It's also Samoa, but it's called American Samoa because it's an American territory. They've also found similar kinds of things, a lack of beaches in various areas where there now are beaches. So again, we've gone all around this island, done these cores, found no evidence of Lapita or really early sites, found some evidence of lack of shorelines to begin with, which might be a reason why people didn't settle here. So these people can go anywhere they want to at any time 3,000 years ago. Fiji has 300 islands with many beaches. Tonga nearby has many beaches and the kinds of environments that people like to settle in. Samoa doesn't seem like it had these nice beaches 3,000 years ago. That might be a reason why people didn't settle there. And so what we've done with this piece is we've kind of proposed that, again, in that piece right there, but also in other research that we've done, proposed that, well, yes, the island is sinking, and that could be that's a reason certainly why some of these sites have been destroyed. We propose that actually, perhaps it was really a small population that settled Samoa at first, and we're not going to find any more Lapita sites, or very, very few. And what I want to point out with this proposal is that it's testable. Anyone can go out there and prove me wrong by doing the work. I know maybe it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, and maybe just to say, prove me wrong, but because it's not easy, because it's expensive and you got to do a lot of work. But what I'm proposing is an answer that can be wrong. So I'm offering it. If you can make these observations, my explanation is kaput, doesn't work anymore. I'm wrong. And I think that is a really important for me, a really important part of the archaeology I do. That I want to propose explanations for which I can be wrong. And I want to give people the tools to prove me wrong. I mean, and by tools, I mean things like sharing data, which is almost all my publications for the last 15 years, where they have data that's kind of like underlies the analysis. It's not just a theory paper. It's all the data's online. Because I want people to prove me wrong. And then maybe I'm being a bit, I don't want to say disingenuous about that, because the kinds of work I do, it's probably, well, I guess when I publish stuff when I'm really, really confident that I'm right, right? I've amassed all this data that supports what I'm saying. However, if you find this, I'll be wrong. And I think that's a really important thing. I think it's a really important thing to do in archaeology. And I don't know if many of our colleagues agree. Unless a lot of the archaeology you read is not written that way. It's not written in the way that, here's the tools that you need to prove me wrong, so please go do that. But I find everything else deeply unsatisfying. Okay, so I'm rambling on a bit too much, but we'll continue with the last couple of papers here. This is a paper from 2018, and again, this is one of the papers where I've, I guess as a theme, as I talk about this, this is the theme is it emerging is I'm looking at old problems and addressing them again, I think, with new ideas and different theory and techniques. And I should quick to point out, the ideas are on my own. I use ecology and evolutionary theory to investigate issues. And of course, much of those ideas were built not by me, they're built by my colleagues, right? And people who are really incredible thinkers and writers. And I steal their ideas. I don't steal them. I use their ideas for my stuff. So another problem here, and again, it's similar to what we've been discussing, but takes it in a slightly different way. And that is, again, here we have this dashed line whereby to the west or the left of this line, people have been living there for 50,000 years. And remember that I said 3,000 years ago, they burst across that line and quickly colonized, settled all of these islands in the blink of an eye. And they were going back and forth across all those islands. I mean, the kicker here is that this is a water gap. This is a water gap that requires open ocean sailing, meaning you sail away from Santa Ana here in the Solomon Islands, you sail away and you can no longer see the islands behind you. There's nothing in front of you either. You're in open ocean without any side of land. That's the first, it's a bit equivocal, but that's the first time that occurs in this whole area. So that's really the biogeographical boundary that kept people to the west. But once they figured out celestial navigation, that boundary no longer mattered. And again, they zipped right over there and settled this whole area. Now, my kind of question I was thinking, but again, anthropologists and archaeologists ponder is, why do people do it? Why did they do that? Why do they go across that boundary and settle those lands? Maybe you think the answer is really kind of obvious, but most archaeologists talk about humans' innate desire to discover, right? As a reason why that occurred. A wanderlust. Also, some anthropologists and archaeologists in the region talk about, they use an idea called the right of primogeniture, which is basically, maybe you know, firstborn sons get most of everything, everyone else gets less. And that is that kind of system of firstborn sons getting power and family land and whatnot. That is largely a kind of a cultural trait of populations in this region today. In the chiefly societies of Samoa and Tonga, not always, but the vast majority of the time, the kind of titles and power and authority over the family and all the trappings that come with that, that is passed down through the male line. So the firstborn son, again, I found, in thinking about that, I found those deeply unsatisfying. No way to evaluate that. How would you ever know? I just couldn't imagine how we would evaluate those propositions. What could I observe? How could you prove me wrong? If I said that was the answer, what could you go observe to prove me wrong? I can't think of anything. So very, very kind of unsatisfying, like I said. So what I did is, I thought, okay, wait a second. This is actually probably one of the favorite articles I've ever written in my life, because it's mostly just theory. I mean, that's not the reason why I like it, but because I thought this problem is this. I was like, why do people do this? And I thought, okay, wait a second. Non-human organisms from higher primates on down migrate. They move around. Why do they do that? What's the explanation for migration and movement amongst populations? And as you probably guessed, lots of biologists have investigated this in a host of species, right? Everything from higher primates, our paleoanthropological ancestors, to fish, to birds are the primary example for this. And in getting into that literature, I found a series of concepts that made sense to explain this. And it's largely based on the idea that movement is expensive, right? And I mean, generally. If you're an organism, like we all are, staying where you are is cheap, so to speak. Going 1,000 kilometers that way is expensive. So you would only move if it was to your benefit in this kind of evolutionary system, right? And I use the term benefit really, really loosely. But I mean, expensive things are typically under selection, right? So selection weeds out inefficiencies, again, really broadly construed. So I thought, okay, there must have been some kind of selective reason for populations moving into that part of the world because it's expensive. I said that people would go back and forth, but certainly not every mission or every sailing voyage was successful. Certainly there were some toll in terms of human fitness. So that was my main idea, that I'll apply these same kinds of explanations for non-human migration and movement to this record and see if I can derive some empirical expectations, some way to test these ideas. So what I did is I first kind of reconceptualized the archaeological record using concepts from ecological and evolutionary explanations of animal movement. So that's what's down on the bottom slide there. Simply some things like different kinds of movement that ecologists recognize: nomadism, excursions where you go out and come back, nomadism where you move all across a landscape, shifting, which is, they just define that as taking part of your home range and moving it slightly this way. And I took those ideas, those are the kinds of ideas that these ecologists use to explain animal movement, and I tried to apply them to the archaeological record. As I said earlier, if we're in the sciences, generally, the way you describe and observe the world should match up with your ideas about how you explain the world. So if you're using evolution and ecology to explain the world, you can't just describe it in any other way you want to, right? There has to be, you have to, I mean, there's a reason why ecologists talk about things like species, right? That's a particularly useful unit of observation when you're dealing with evolution and ecology. And so I took these useful units and tried to apply them to the archaeological record. And in doing so, I just kind of mapped them down here, looking at the distribution of archaeological ceramic assemblages, if they are continuously distributed, and so continuous distribution, all of the same age, that would be a range. The area within which people are, right, is mapped by ceramic assemblages, or archaeological sites for that matter. If you have a continuous distribution of ceramics, but they are changing in age over time, so there's the early stuff here, and then as you move across space, you get later and later and later, that would conform to the definition of range expansion, of shifting, people shifting their area, shifting their kind of locations over space. So I did that for all these different kinds. I took all of these ideas here and put them into a classification of ceramic assemblages based upon their distribution and time. And then I took that and I mapped that onto what is the distribution of, or the characteristics of Lapita ceramic assemblages. And it turns out that they match this kind of idea of a range expansion. And in that paper, I won't go into the nitty-gritty of it, but looking at a host of environmental data and chronological data on ceramic assemblages, seems to me the best explanation is one that that the Lapita expansion into this part of the Pacific is best described as a selection-driven range expansion. And I have some expectations in that article about, if this is true, here's what you should find in terms of paleo-environment in this part of the world, and here's what the paleo-environment should look like in this part of the world, and here's what the changes should be like in terms of chronology. Go prove me wrong. That's what I did with this paper. But hasn't been, as you might gather, not many of my regional colleagues are that excited about this, because they are still more interested in kind of those ideas about what I'll call human inventiveness, or not, that's a bad term, human intention and desire and drive as explanations for why people do things. And again, I just find that not very satisfying because it's difficult to evaluate. But with this kind of process, you can evaluate, I provide in this paper ways to evaluate what I'm saying. And again, one of my favorite papers, because I took this problem that people have been not really addressing, just kind of saying, well, it had to be this, and so just accept it and let's move on, to no, that can't be the way we do things. There's got to be a way to propose an explanation for this that we can then evaluate. And so I just want to, like I said, one of my favorite papers. But it hasn't been cited that much. It's been cited more by colleagues outside my region who do ecology and evolution than colleagues inside my region who do Lapita stuff. They don't really care about this. Okay, sorry, I'm waffling on, but this is my last paper. So again, remember I said at the beginning that I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about Pacific Islander archaeology. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned about the region, and also what I've learned about how I come to do archaeology, what I find most valuable about doing as a way to do archaeology. And again, this last paper, a couple years ago, I think I might have even spoken about this paper last time I was here, but this addressed another problem that people in the Pacific have thought about for decades, and that is in island Southeast Asia, which that map is right there. You can see in the lower right of that map, the tail corner of Papua New Guinea. So down there off the lower left is where we start to see those islands of the Pacific. The movement of those Lapita populations out into the Pacific 3,000 years ago, many people argue that that is actually the kind of last burst of movement from a longer trail of migration that began in Taiwan and moved down through island Southeast Asia and out into the Pacific. And that's what these dashed arrows refer to. And it's typically called the out of Taiwan hypothesis for the origins of, people used to say the origins of the Polynesians, but you could say the origins of Pacific Islanders. That people who burst out, as I said, into Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, that they originated here in this couple thousand-year trail of pottery out into the Pacific. They also went from here down to Borneo, but that's the out of Taiwan hypothesis. And there's another hypothesis which is not nearly as promoted by archaeologists, and that is that populations from mainland Southeast Asia came into island Southeast Asia and then moved around a lot and then went out into the Pacific. And this has a variety of names, this hypothesis, and actually they escape me right now, but we'll just call it the mainland Southeast Asia hypothesis. So those are two hypotheses for the origins of the Polynesians, stretching way back into island Southeast Asia. And they're based on ceramic chronologies. Because remember I said Lapita is this ceramics that appear all of a sudden, and they're beautiful and highly decorated. 1,000 years before those ceramics appear in the Pacific, ceramics appear here in island Southeast Asia, like a precursor to that. And the dates people use is they suggest that the pottery up here is oldest, then it appears here, and then Papua New Guinea just before 3,000 years ago, which is true, and then out in the Pacific. And so they have this kind of chronology of pottery movement that they use to support their arguments. However, people go back and forth about, specialists in the region go back and forth about, oh, this date's wrong and that date's wrong and the context over here is bad, this pottery isn't similar enough, blah, 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 constantly. So what my colleagues and I did, two colleagues with this paper, is we looked at the entire radiocarbon record for island Southeast Asia and that associated with this pottery, because there's a long history in island Southeast Asia of human populations, been there for tens of thousands of years. But we just looked at the pottery dates, and instead of picking and choosing pottery dates that supported, preferentially one or the other hypothesis, which is what people do in this part of the world, and taking even kind of people will take a date range for an assemblage, right, which has a beginning and end, a long date range, and they'll choose the earliest end of that range and say, this is the date for this pottery assemblage, which if you know anything about radiocarbon dating, you can't do that. They're all equally valid, all dates. Well, they're all equally valid in the date range, but also they need to be associated with the pottery because you're dating charcoal in this part of the world, not pottery itself or quartzes or anything like that. And so we went back through this entire corpus of radiocarbon dates and evaluated them for their validity in terms of their association with ceramics. We also evaluated them in terms of we did a Bayesian chronological analysis of all these assemblages and arranged them in time. This is one of the results of that. And what our results say is that, this says Luzon, that's the Philippines. And this is Borneo right here. And then we have Itabayat, which is up here. Sulawesi, which is right here. All really kind of indistinguishable. When you take a really critical examination of the radiocarbon data and you don't have any preconceived notions about what is the correct answer is we don't know what the answer is. You cannot distinguish these two hypotheses based on the radiocarbon record. It's just not possible. What it really looks like is that ceramics are appearing all over this region at roughly the same time, being here and then here and then here and then here, everywhere, which, again, we can't distinguish these hypotheses. That was one of our conclusions. And if I have another slide there. Yeah. This is only a couple years old, but again, you could prove me wrong in this paper by doing more radiocarbon dates, redoing my analyses, all the data is there for anyone to play with, and showing how this order of assemblages is not correct. But no one's been able to do that yet. Maybe they will. It's only been a couple of years. And actually, I'm fine with that. I'm totally fine with that, because I just want to know what the answer is. I don't really care what the answer is. I just want to know what it is. Again, I think that's a really good approach for social science academics, is to we're all in this together to find the right answer, not for me to kind of steamroller you into believing my answer, despite what the data say. Yes, we can't distinguish these hypotheses. And there was also, up here I have, if you look at the literature, ad hoc and ad hominem, that means ad hominem, kind of attacking the person who said the thing versus attacking the answer itself. So not trying to dissect their results, but dissecting the person who said it. That's what an ad hominem attack is. That seems to be pretty prevalent around here. This is not my research area. And actually one of the reviewers of this paper in +1 pointed that out, and it has a total ad hominem attack in the review. So something like, Ethan's a dilettante, doesn't know what he's doing here, blah, blah, blah. Had nothing constructive. And, and when I, if you're watching, when I went to the editor, I said, this reviewer has just kind of said I'm an idiot, but didn't say what I can do to make the paper better. So I don't know what to, and so I said, so I'm going to, tell them to F off, what can I do? And anyways, so people get really, they want to attack the person when they have no other recourse because the data don't say what they want it to say, what they want. But anyways, so again, one of my kind of things I've learned from this paper is that we don't know the answer to this, and that's a fine answer to not know the answer. But also that, again, a critical approach to data, have your data out there so people can evaluate it, and generate conclusions that people could shoot down, right, that they could test so we can all get to the right answer. That's my last slide, except for this little summary. What have I learned? So in that, and since I started, my first publication was 1998, so I don't know how many years that is, but what have I learned? Not a whole lot about the substantive, like how do we explain the archaeological record of the Pacific Islands. I've learned a little bit. I've generated some, I think, important knowledge in Samoa and Fiji and other places, little bits that we now know this is the answer to this thing, so let's move on. But I've also, less about conclusions, but I've also learned about, especially in the last, I'd say 10 years, about, I think, what the best way to generate knowledge is, and that's kind of what I've tried to get across today. Other things, pay attention to classification, observation issues, because the kind of theory I use is, well, all theory is really, it sets up research problems. It defines for us what are the important problems to address, because it tells us what are the processes that are relevant out there in the world, whether we use evolution or structuralism or whether we use Newtonian mechanics or Einsteinian physics. Those theory sets the research problem, tells you how you're going to answer questions and what questions are valid, or not valid is maybe a better wrong word, important, appropriate, relevant. Because that's what theory does. And I think that's very important to have up front. And as well, you need to link your observations of the world to the theory you're using. Because after all, we look at the exact same stuff that other social scientists and scientists look at. Rocks, right? The difference between me and a geologist, the only difference is the ideas we have in our heads. We look at the exact same stuff. And so theory is really important because it tells us how to look at that stuff, which is all the same. Lastly, I think we should set up research problems that address kind of the empirical world, and we should set them up in a way that we should give our colleagues the tools to try to prove us wrong, because that, I think, produces this long-lasting knowledge. I went a bit long, sorry, and it seemed a bit, I don't know, me, but I guess that's what this is about. Anyways, thank you, and we can questions if you want. My one color picture of Samoa, that's where I work. Sure. Oh.
Well, thank you, Ethan, for your explanation. And it's really important, that discussion about to publish the data so everybody can work with that. But my question is kind of related to a project that I'm developing now. And some parts of your presentation got my attention when we are we have to discuss about human dispersal, mobility, and etc. And you said about, I think, in Fiji groups, the second paper that you present, that they changed their social, probably they changed something, the way that they were organized, because I don't know if, well, they start to have more chiefdoms, like, you know. And I am reading a lot of ethnography and ethnoarchaeological work. And then you said in the next paper that you use ecology, evolutionary archaeology to understand the results. And I also read some papers that they say that when people are going to a new landscape, they tend to observe the animal behavior, so they can understand better what they can do, what they can eat, how they can move, etc. So my question is, how what do you think about ethnography and ethnoarchaeology applied to this discussion? Because I don't know if you use these themes just because you didn't talk about it, and it's more a particular question. So to think about my research, like.
No, I have ideas, and they are simply that there's two ways to use. I'll just stick to ethnography first for a second, right? There is, I think, probably the primary use that archaeologists apply to use ethnography for is they read an ethnographic description, and they use that ethnographic description to fill in the details of the archaeological record. Right? So they try to reconstruct a past ethnographic description of the archaeological record, which is a bunch of junk in the ground, using ethnography, right? That's one way it's used. So for example, in the Pacific and with chiefdoms, we have lots of ethnographic descriptions of how these societies in the Pacific were functioning at the time of European contact. An example would be many of these societies had, what's like societies do around the world, these kind of ceremonies of first fruits. So the first crops of the season, for example, are given to higher ranking people, right? In ceremonies. And that's described ethnographically, right? We know that that happened. Now, people have used, in the Pacific, used those descriptions of places like Tonga to say, okay, this part of the archaeological record, it was an area for those first fruits ceremonies. Right? So that's just taking the ethnographic record and using it to kind of make the archaeological record an ethnographic one. I think, and again, there's no way to kind of, it's difficult to evaluate whether that description is correct or not, of the ethnographic one. However, the way I think ethnographies are best used is to treat them as data. They are observations of people and cultural systems and behaviors to be explained. They're not the explanations, they're data observations to be explained. Why are there first fruit ceremonies across time and space, and well, across the ethnographic record? I don't know, but that would be a generalization that we could explain. So again, I see them as, you know, there's the archaeological record, which is the material results of human behavior, and then you go up under the ethnographic record. The ethnographic record, the written one, is a written record of human behavior. Again, not an explanation, it's something to be, it's a description to be explained. Many ethnographers, I think, explain the ethnographic record they're creating by using the culturally bound explanations of the people they're describing. Right, here's the Fijian ethnographic record, and here's how Fijians explain their world. But I think we could also just say, here's the Fijian ethnographic record. It describes all these variations in behavior across the archipelago 200 years ago. How do we explain that variation in behavior? So it's data points. Another example is oral traditions in Samoa. I didn't talk about this research, but just finishing up a project where we are identifying, describing all of these walls and ditches and platforms are constructed beginning around 800 years ago in this area of Samoa. And it's just a huge burst of activity. All kinds of, like I said, stone walls, stone ditches, platforms, and there's also coordinated environmental change. People cut down the forests, started growing different crops. So all that's just basic description. And it's pretty, I want to say, objective, uncontroversial way we describe what we find. Why that happened, that's what you could talk about in using these different kinds of processes. However, in oral tradition, Samoan oral tradition, which is recorded in the 1800s, really meticulously recorded by a German, because the Germans were the colonial power in Samoa at that time. If you look at these oral traditions, a lot of these chiefly genealogies, this massive expansion of chiefs occurred. And if you count the generations, you know, if you give 35 years per generation or so, that expansion of kind of chiefs and warfare between chiefs begins about 800 years ago. That's pretty cool. I mean, I'm not saying that that explains the archaeological record, but they're two different kinds of data that something's going on, right? About 800 years ago in Samoa. What are the processes that explain that? So again, I don't dismiss ethnography at all. I simply think it's data to be explained and not an explanation itself. Yeah, and it's, yeah, so in the Pacific, you have lots of really rich ethnographic record because Europeans came there and in the, well, beginning with increasing intensity in the 1700s to these functioning indigenous populations, right? And we're able to record them. And it's true, there's still lots of issues, the same issues with ethnography of bias and exclusions and European ethnocentrism and all those kinds of things. But it's still an incredible record, an ethnographic record. Yeah.
Yeah, can I speak in English? Thanks. Ethan, actually, I have a lot of doubts because you said you are using some evolutionary theory, no? First, I would like to ask about use motive like attributes in your research. Yes. I understand this way. In evolution, generally, we talk about changes in sense for gradual change, no? Gradual change, slowly. I would like to understand if we use just motive, just one, how can I say, big attributes, no? Other than structural attributes. For example, burning, pottery, cook pottery, or non-plastic, like this. If we use these big attributes, no, and in some way isolated, no motifs. If we are talking in this case about jumps in evolution, in register, rather than gradual evolution. In this sense, we can stay in a kind of contradiction with our theory, evolutionary theory, no? Because I am thinking about principles, logical principles in evolution. And second question, sorry. Okay.
Don't forget. So the question is largely, you stated that evolution is gradual. I would disagree, right? I mean, evolution is just purely depends upon generation time. That's it. That's all, right? So the generation time, that is the transmission of information from one entity to the next, can take a long time. In biological transmission of long-lived organisms, it takes a long time. In the transmission, but not all biological organisms. You look at petri dishes of bacteria, and they go through 200 generations in 2 days, right, or something like that. So I think previously, yes, evolutionists described evolution as gradual, and that was one of the main reasons why, not remain, that was a reason why evolutionary theorists said you couldn't apply evolutionary theory to human culture because that's not gradual. But I think that kind of argument has been, demolished is too hard a term, but shown to be wanting because it's not gradual, it's simply generation time. But I take your point that, and the generation time is an issue to think about because one reason it's an issue to think about is because of when information is, different kinds of information, genetic, cultural, linguistic, is subjected to different generation times, perhaps different kinds of transmission processes are relevant. And we might not recognize those, we might not recognize that when we're trying to explain the archaeological record. So what is the generational time of this, of the archaeological record that I'm characterizing in terms of information? And so therefore what transmission processes might apply? So it's not, I don't want to dismiss what you're saying, but I want to say it's not a fatal flaw. It's an issue to be addressed in research. Does that kind of get at what you're asking about? But you also talked about motifs.
I made this question because always I have a doubt how to, what kind of attribute
Yeah,
to make it.
sure.
All the time, how can I say, classical.
Mm-hmm.
Classical.
Yeah.
Make it
Can I say something? I would say the kind of construction of attributes, or what we're talking about is how do we construct these units of observation by which we make counts of things? Do we count ceramic motifs, or do we count of different kinds, or do we count vessel shapes, or do we count assemblage types, or do we count site types, or do we count settlement system types? I mean, as I said in that first slide, it's all made up by us. So we need to construct these units within which we count things, and we need to, as you're right, it's kind of like almost like a hypothesis itself. I am proposing that this unit tracks, or the variation I create with that unit will be relevant to transmission. And I should be able to justify to you, the reader, why that's the case. And a valid criticism of work, my work or others, that would be you have not justified why this particular measurement unit is actually producing distributions, counts of things that are relevant to an explanation by transmission. Absolutely spot on criticism. And what I would say in some instances, I would say that the argument for, say, those Lapita decorations is that the motifs are kind of this repeated set of impressions that we see in different areas around the archipelago, around these assemblages. So it looks like they're the units of similarity, I guess. And also we would expect that, I would argue in that particular case, that motifs, the way you decorate your pot, is probably not constrained by environments, population size, selection in general. So it's probably a good measure of just transmission and not, say, environments or selection. I could be wrong, right? But that would be how I would justify my unit of observation to you. And you might look and say, okay, are particular motifs only found in particular environments? I don't know, cave sites, open sites, other sites. Then you might say, hey, it does look like these motifs are tracking something else, not just transmission purely. But you had more?
Yes, I understood. Yes, well, the second question, I guess there is some relation with this first question and with your answer about how recognize these motifs, similarity to these motifs. For example, similarity, these how can I say, these big attributes. I was thinking. how to make this recognize this, if this is other question, no? It's analogy or homology, no? This, because, for example, you bring ecology for evolutionary explanation in archaeology. I perceive as well Kaulipo present something in his work similar like this. But I guess Darwinian archaeologists, most authors present a kind of prejudice for ecology, use ecology in explanation. But I guess this similarity, could be better understood, this similarity or analogy, or if this homology or difference, if we bring ecology, of course. For example, if we see some attribute very similar and we investigate composition, for example, chemistry or inclusion, mineral or chemical, that composition, and see if we have, of course, that similarity, or if it's just some impression we have about attributes. So I would like understand. Of course, I think it's a positive answer for this problem I put here. If ecology and ecological analysis can help us to make this difference between analogy and homology, because we talk a lot of analogy and homology, but I think we don't make difference. So just to finish. Because, for example, I think it was a question processualists put in debate to criticize cultural history archaeology, because we see a lot of attributes, but we don't make this difference, and I think ecology could be a good, how can I say, tools to make difference. Thanks. Sorry.
Here's my answer. No, so your question is how do we distinguish homology from analogy? Right, that's roughly your question. Is that correct? And I know it has a long history, and homology and analogy in archaeology, in evolutionary sciences, and you know what homology and analogy is, the kind of similar as it refers to, and ecological tools to distinguish homology and analogy. First, I would just say some really basic tools, not necessarily ecological ones. So, for example, the similarities in these Lapita motifs. Again, it's kind of always, everything's always a proposal that should be justified. But I would argue that those similarities are homologous, right? They're not independent inventions because of space and time. Their similarities closely there in space and time, more likely that they are homology, representative of descent, relatedness. Not those Lapita ceramic assemblages with one of the reasons is because those decorations are so complex. It's extremely unlikely that they would be independently invented across those populations. I mean, impossible because of their complexity. However, if you look at pots in Africa that have triangles on them, pots in Thailand have triangles on them. That's not homology. Again, we would just argue that. Yes. So there's that. That's a very simple non-ecological tool, just a kind of time-space analysis. There's also, and there's a good example of that. A guy named David Meltzer did a paper way back in 1981. And yeah, Meltzer was a Dunhill student. And but he took this lithic assemblage from Africa and a lithic assemblage from the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And he did a bunch of statistical analysis on morphology. And the assemblages are identical in terms of the shapes of tools. And one's from like the African assemblages from the, 10, 15,000 years ago. And the one in the US is from 1,000 years ago. Obviously, those similarities are analogy. Those populations were not in contact with one another. So again, that's again a time-space analysis. However, there's an ecological way to do that, and that what you're also asking about is something called Galton's problem, which was Galton in the late 1800s was trying to figure out just exactly that. How do we determine similarities amongst populations that are a result of relatedness or convergence? And people like Ruth Mace and her students have developed a series of quantitative tools to investigate that. So what it basically involves is creating a cladistic tree of relatedness amongst, I'm trying to do that with my hand, of populations, right? And so these populations are related at various degrees based on linguistics usually. And then you map a cultural trait shared by all those language families across that tree. And using kind of high-powered quantitative methods, you can determine what's the likelihood that based on the branching relatedness of those populations in terms of linguistics, what's the likelihood that the similar traits in this population here and that population there are independently invented or the product of relatedness, i.e. homology? And you can estimate, you can construct these quantitative arguments that give you the probabilities of either of those answers based on a series of assumptions that you input into the analysis. So for the life of me, that kind of analysis is escaping me, what it's called. But Ruth Mace, Mason Pagel in 1994, Current Anthropology, that's the article where they introduced this method. What's it called? And it's so quantitative, and it allows you to evaluate in an ecological framework, I would say, just that, homology versus analogy. So let's look that up afterwards. Mason Pagel, 94. That's the article where that whole kinds of analysis begins. So it's a really cool way, because you can't, obviously you can't ultimately say this is analogy, full stop, and this is homology, full stop. But you can say, given this history of language relatedness and this distribution of other traits, it is extremely unlikely that these two instances of this trait are analogous. They almost have to be homology, so you can do that quantitatively. Yeah, but it's a really good, you should look that up if that's interested. If that's part of your research, you should look up that. Astolfo and Mercedes know this stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Regarding the final bullet point, in the years since that article was published, have you come any closer to an answer? Oh, no, that one on the 2006 article. Oh, no. And also, do you find chiefdoms to be a useful unit of observation? And if so, how would they be observed in the archaeological record?
Yeah. Sorry. Because everyone talks about chiefdoms, right? And so there's a couple, no, I don't know the answer to that, or if that's important, but I suspect it is, demography and populations moving. But there's a couple different things here. I would never use, and never have, nor never will, use chiefdom as an analytical unit, meaning to like count up parts of the archaeological record. I can't think of an operational definition of chiefdom as a counting tool that's also related to a set of explanatory processes. That's kind of a convoluted way to say something, overly complicated way to say it, but that's just for that's units as tools for generating counts of stuff. But we also all use, I use the word chiefdom every day, because when I said it to one of my colleagues, they know what I'm talking about. Right? Everyone has a general idea what a chiefdom is. Redistributive economy, inherited status, kind of big populations, intensified agriculture, more or less. Some not. Some of those they have, some of those they don't. But when I talk about chiefdoms, people have an idea what I'm talking about. And so I would never say that, you can't use that kind of term. It's just as an analytical category, as something you use to count up stuff. It's not useful. It's kind of the ethnographic thing as well. People will say, oh, ancient Hawaii was a chiefdom. And so, let me give it a different example, because ancient Hawaii was described by people beginning in 1776. But, other places where there's not as rich an ethnographic tradition, they might say, well, Samoa was a chiefdom, and so we know these things were going on. We don't have any evidence, physical evidence for that, but it must have been going on. So that's the thing I don't think is useful. Analytically, not chiefdoms is not a useful category. But to get information across, yeah, it certainly does. And yeah, my PhD student is investigating that last bullet point. So hopefully she'll be done in a couple months. No, she'll be done by the end of this year. But it's looking like, what it's looking like is that her research, just to talk briefly about it, is that if chiefdoms are described by new kind of behaviors in terms of the production and distribution of stuff, right? Ceramics in this case. We should see changes in ceramic technology and production and their distribution across the landscape. We should see changes in that occurring around the time that people think chiefdoms in Fiji began, about 800 years ago. All her data to date suggests no, that didn't change, did not occur across the archipelago in a uniform way. If that's related to chiefdoms, I mean, again, chiefdoms is when the Europeans first got to Fiji, they described these chiefdoms, right? Which is loose, or these organizations of people, but what they really, all the characteristics they may have had, I don't know. Yeah. Hope that answered kind of your question, yeah.
So you talked about Samoa, about coastline development and how that affects the choice for where you migrate. And it got me thinking when you talked about the Taiwan and the China hypothesis. If people, when they look at those hypotheses, because, I mean, the geological time scale, you've just come from a period where the sea level has varied a lot. So coastline development takes some time and depends on the sedimentary conditions. So it wasn't uniform in all the hundreds and thousands of isles, I suppose. So when you look at those those cultural spread hypotheses, do people like often take into account the shoreline development, if it applies to other islands, or is mostly just a Samoa thing? How much is it taken into account?
I would say not taken into account very much or very well. But you're right. Even around islands of Southeast Asia, I mean, yeah, I just had my example from Samoa, right? But there is absolutely, over the last, we're talking the last kind of 6,000 years or so in this part of the world, that these two hypotheses were supposed to have played out. Yes, there was absolutely shoreline changes across those 6,000 years. So we probably do not, well, I'm certain there are coastal sites that are inundated and destroyed in that part of the world that would be relevant to this problem. Absolutely, absolutely. But also, shoreline reconstruction in that part of the world, in the island Southeast Asia, is non-existent. There is one paper that has proposed shoreline reconstructions of the Luzon area, northern Philippines. I talked about this yesterday with Letitia, and I don't trust the paper, sorry to say, to that author, only because the author provides no data and no description of the method of how they reconstructed the shoreline. We have no way to know how the shoreline was reconstructed. It looks as if the person simply, in an ArcGIS model, lowered the sea level and then used the bathymetry to describe a new shoreline. It looks like that, but I honestly don't know because there's no method provided. But that's what it looks like. And that's the only shoreline reconstruction I can think of in that part of the world. So that's why I say hasn't been done in a way that I think is robust, I'll say. But you're right, absolutely. And I mean, this is way out of the time period, but 20,000 years ago, Borneo was attached to mainland Southeast Asia. This was a giant landmass, and so there's archaeological sites all around here under the water. We'll never have access to. Well, I shouldn't say that, but yeah. And New Guinea was attached to Australia until about 20,000 years ago. So yeah, it's a huge part of that record. But that's also, I mean, in the world, right? I mean, that's the same thing all up and down the west coast of North America, across the Arabian Peninsula, all those areas, that kind of stuff. Baltic Sea, all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question from the people who are watching online on YouTube, and it's a question about the next steps, or what we will do in the next 25 years or something like this, and also how. But also, how do you think that your international collaborations or collaboration with colleagues from other areas have contributed towards building a better picture of the ancient Pacific?
Two things. I think, first off, I think it's kind of cliche to say this, but it's just getting more and more exciting. And the stuff we know now, and I didn't give you any kind of good or big or thorough picture of our knowledge of the Pacific. I said there's a lot of unanswered questions, frankly, but compared to 10 years ago, we know a huge amount more in the Pacific. So I remember, when I was a grad student 25 years, I finished my PhD 20 years ago. So 25 years ago, I was a grad student, and we know so much more than we did 25 years ago. It's mind-boggling. Every time I teach Pacific Island archaeology, kind of as a class every year or whatever, every other year. And every time I teach the class, there's new stuff to talk about, stuff that's kind of, and over the course of 5 years, the stuff I talked about 5 years ago is just dramatically changed, or was just more new data, I guess, to add to it. So in 25 years, it's just going to keep getting more and more data and more information out there. Maybe you, as archaeologists, run across this too when you talk to someone who doesn't do archaeology, or just someone on the bus, whatever, and they say, have we dug everything up already? I get that question every now and then. I'm just like, no. It's like, A, no, and it hardly requires excavation, but no, there's so much to do and think about. And I think it's just going to be constant kind of like mind-boggling stuff that comes out. I mean, mind-boggling for specialists. I mean, not the average person on the bus doesn't care, but mind-boggling for specialists. And so I think that the next 25 years is just going to be just more and more discovery and more interesting and more high quality data to test things, I hope. Lots more paleoenvironmental stuff, lots more ADNA stuff. And international collaborations, that is key. And I don't know the history of the person who asked the question, but as a younger scholar, at least when I was a younger scholar, it was more about doing my own research and getting my own papers out there with the first name in the front kind of stuff. But you learn at some point that that's just not the way. It's like you need everyone's help. And so the cooler stuff I've done, besides that one paper, was that on the migration stuff, which was just me. but the really cool stuff you need everyone else to help you. So I need the geoscientist, I need the paleobotanist, I need the DNA person, all to work together to produce this really cool data and possible answers. So I think international collaborations are key and really the way to go. And collaboration in general. And a friend of mine, a colleague actually, he talked to me about collaborating on research projects. He used the phrase, you have to learn how to marry well. Meaning it's always good to work with good people. It always comes back to you in a positive way. If you are generous with your collaborations and your co-authorships, it'll always come back to you, because you want to say, hey, I really love what you do. I want you to work on this project. Let's co-author this paper together. That just snowballs. People start offering you the same thing. And then you're just always on all this research that you're not always the first author, but it doesn't matter really. And you're producing all this stuff and you're a part of it. So collaboration, and I think you learned that, at least I did. I learned the importance of that more and more. But there's a reason for that too. When you're a young scholar, you're trying to make your name and get the job. And so you want to be first author on things. And, I understand that too, because I did the same thing. So, but yeah, collaboration it's key. That's why Mercedes is doing GMM on my ads. And I am zapping Glauco's sermon.
True. Oh, true. My former PhD supervisor used to say that science demands generosity, and I guess it's true. Anyways, I would like to thank you, Ethan, for another talk here. And okay, I'm going to switch to Portuguese. E obrigada às pessoas que nos acompanharam no canal do YouTube online. Thank you for everyone who is watching online on YouTube. E obrigada aqui a vocês que estão presencialmente. Uma salva de palmas para o Ethan, por favor.
Thank you for the question, too. Amazing, like I'm always right in someone's face. I'm trying to keep it.